Welcome back to Andersen Acres. Today we're not going to bake. Instead, I'm going to talk about the difference between a kneaded dough and a batter dough, because tomorrow we are actually going to be making a batter dough, a batter bread. So I think it's a good time to talk about the differences, because that doesn't look like this. That doesn't look like what we've been doing for the last few weeks. So I'm just going to talk about how they're different and how they are both yeast breads, because they are. These breads do have something in common, even though they don't look anything like each other. They are leavened with yeast. They both have yeast in them. That's why they're called yeast breads, and that's why they're in my yeast breads playlist. They all use yeast. Now, yeast is a microorganism that activates with a food. It's typically sugar and your flour, or honey in your flour. This one's honey. This doesn't have any sugar in it. That one has sugar in it. So you can either use sugar or honey. So this one's using honey. And it also uses water to help start it up, because if you just throw it in a pan with some sugar, it's not going to do anything. It needs the water to start dissolving. And it also needs warmth. As the yeast grows and multiplies, it creates some gas bubbles that can cause bread dough to rise. That's why we get all this fluffy puffiness. This hasn't risen yet. This is just it's after I've mixed it. I just made this a few minutes ago. So it hasn't risen yet. But it will. But when you are talking about yeast breads, there are two big categories. There's batter and there's kneaded. Kneaded is what you're most familiar with. That's what we use to make our white breads, our rye breads, our whole wheat breads. This is what you will most often be doing. It is the most common. Okay? Kneaded dough distributes ingredients evenly and develops gluten in the flour, which provides strength, elasticity, and strength to our bread. The kneading process gives it an even texture, because you don't see any lumps or bumps in this. It gives it a nice even texture. So kneading it, folding it over and kneading it, gives it a nice even texture and a smooth rounded top when you make most of your breads. Obviously, if you added something like raisins or granola to your bread, your tops won't be entirely smooth. But outside of that, a kneaded bread dough should have a fairly smooth top. Kneading can be done by hand or using a heavy-duty mixer or with a food processor. You can use a bread maker. It doesn't matter, actually. The kneading itself is important, not how you do it. So don't let someone tell you that just because you're using your mixer or you're using your bread maker that you're not making real bread. You are. It doesn't actually matter. It has no effect on the final product. Kneaded breads are usually shaped by hand. So obviously if you're baking in your bread maker, you're not shaping it by hand, but typically I would take this after it's risen and make buns or a loaf out of it, or whatever other shape I was after. They're usually shaped and require 2 risings. So some examples are, like I said, your white breads, your rye breads, your whole wheat breads. This is a honey roll. There's so many examples, and 90% of the breads you're going to make fall into this category. Batter breads, however, are this guy. I'm not going to stick my fingers in it because he's actually fairly wet. Batter breads sometimes are called shortcut breads because they don't require any kneading. Obviously, you're not going to need that. Look at that. You can't knead that. But they're not really a shortcut at all. They contain less flour and they're stickier, and instead of kneading, you have to kind of beat the dough a little bit. You don't have to be super rough. Like, I just use my dough whisk and I just keep mixing until it's pretty uniform. It'll never be entirely uniform. Okay? You can use an electric mixer to mix this if you like. There's nothing wrong with that. I tend not to because it's more effort than it's worth. So I just do this by hand. I just mix them, but you can use an electric mixer, no problem. This is very difficult to do in a bread maker because look at this. Like, what are you supposed to do with that? Right? You can't really imagine that in a bread maker, and then you're trying to get it out and you're trying to do stuff with it, and it's not handy or helpful. So I wouldn't recommend using a bread maker to do this. You can use an electric hand mixer to do the actual mixing if you want. I just use my dough whisk. So you can do it either way, just avoid the bread maker. It's not going to help you that much with this kind. So after the first addition of flour is when if you're going to use an electric mixer, is when you're going to do it. I just put all my ingredients in a bowl and whip them with my whisk. It's really not rocket science. These are quite easy. So then they have to rise, but they have to rise twice. So just like these, this is rising twice. Okay, it's just one rise is going to be here in this bowl. I always use my big red bowl for all of my batter breads because sometimes they rise a lot and they take about 90 minutes to rise. They take longer to rise. So I always use my big bowl because this could more than double in size, so it could almost fill this bowl. It probably won't, but it happens. So this will have to rise twice, and it does have a coarse texture and a more pebbly surface. So if you look, it's not at all smooth, even though there's cornmeal in this one, so it was never going to be smooth anyway. But you look at this is not going to be a smooth dough. It just isn't. It's a little more pebbly, a little coarser. So a batter bread is still a yeast bread. It's just made differently, but it is still using its yeast as a leavening agent, and they're still a lot of fun to make, and they're still delicious. Like this guy will be delicious when he's done. So I just thought this was a good time to show you the difference between a traditional dough, a kneaded dough, and a wetter batter bread. So that's basically the difference between them. Which one you make doesn't really matter. What do you want, right? It's which do you like better? I love this one. This is a cornmeal roll, and I absolutely love it. In fact, this is the recipe we'll be posting tomorrow. This cornmeal roll, and they're delicious. They're great for breakfast. They're not any easier to make, except you don't have to do the kneading. That's the only shortcut you're taking. You just don't have to knead it. So it's still the same amount of weighting. You notice how gooey my finger gets just from touching it? It's because it's a very wet dough. So it's not a shortcut really. The only thing you're not doing is kneading for 5 minutes. So yeah, big shortcut. So use whatever dough you like. If you like this kind, make this kind. You'll never get the same results as you will with this because they are entirely different kinds of dough, but they are still both yeast breads. So that is about it for us today here at Andersen Acres. We will come back tomorrow with this particular recipe if you want to learn how to make these cornmeal batter rolls, because that's what we're making tomorrow. So we will do that. We're also going to use this bowl to do things like our English muffins and things like that over the course of the next few weeks. So stay tuned and we will get there for you.